The bus windows shook in the wind, and the children inside could barely understand what was happening. The road disappeared beneath the murky water, and the embankment beside it creaked as if it were about to collapse at any moment. The driver pressed buttons that didn't respond. The radio was muted. The cell phone had no signal. Outside, the flood seemed to grow angrily. Crying, screaming, fear. Have you ever felt the sensation of being trapped and forgotten? Meanwhile, on the other side of the road, someone was watching. An old building, almost part of the landscape. But what no one knew was who he really was, and what he was about to do. That shadow standing on the porch was Walter Granger. No one else saw him as important. He was just the old man from the house at the end of the road, who spoke little, walked slowly, and carried something in his eyes that no one could decipher. But he saw everything. Every muffled scream through the windows, every little hand banging on the glass. And he also saw the fear in the eyes that reminded him of other eyes. Back then, in a distant jungle, when he was still young and didn't know the weight of surviving alone. The rain got heavier. The muddy water was already almost halfway up the bus body. One of the tires sank completely. The embankment on the left side began to crack like wet paper. 12 children, with no one around. No help, no hope. Have you ever felt that? That emptiness of knowing you're alone, and that if something doesn't happen now, it might be too late? If this part of the story touched you in any way, if you have ever felt fear, abandonment, or have been saved by someone when you least expected it, write here in the comments. It is your story that strengthens this community and shows that these stories are not just fiction. They reflect real pain, real courage. And if you believe the world still needs to hear more about honor, legacy, and the quiet power of those who don't seek recognition, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every click you make helps this message reach more people who need to hear that heroism still exists, even when no one is looking. Because sometimes what seems like just a quiet man on the porch is the last hope in the midst of the storm. On the weathered wooden porch, Walter Granger stood motionless, gripping tightly the old cane he had inherited from his father. Not out of physical necessity, but out of habit. The rain cut through the sky like a razor, and the sound of screams, though muffled by the storm, pierced the silence of the house like bullets from a distant time. His eyes, sunken and tired, found the road covered in murky water. The first thing he saw was the shape of the bus swaying, as if begging for help. Then small hands on the glass, eyes of pure terror. But what struck him most was a high-pitched, almost animalistic sound, the desperate cry of a small child. A sound that, to many, would seem common in a tragedy like this. To Walter, it wasn't, because that sound brought back a very similar cry, buried for decades. The sound of a wounded boy he couldn't save, lying in the middle of the Asian forest, bleeding and calling for his mother. A boy he had promised to protect. A boy who died clutching his sleeve. Walter hunched over, as if the weight of the memory was pulling him to the ground. He ran his hand over his face, wet not only from the rain, but from a silent, ancient cry that never completely stopped. Inside the house, everything was a memory. On the shelf, medals he no longer displayed. On the wall, a faded portrait of his wife smiling, the only one who knew the truth behind that silence. On the garage floor, a dusty box of war memorabilia he had sworn never to touch again. And yet, that morning, he opened the box. There were the old binoculars with scratched lenses, the military knife, the rusty yellow flashlight, the broken compass, and the rope coiled with worn knots. Walter touched each object as if reliving an oath. It was at that moment that the conflict began within him. The physical pain, caused by the years, by age, by the limitations of his body. And the moral pain, deeper, more cruel. The pain of knowing that he could try, but perhaps he wouldn't succeed. "You're not that man anymore." The phrase echoed like an insult. And he believed it, until he heard a second scream. A scream closer. It was now, or never again. He pulled on the flannel shirt he had worn in his construction days. He stepped into his rubber boots with cracked soles. He taped the flashlight to his chest and looped the rope over his shoulder in a Boy Scout knot. It was as if every movement reawakened a dormant part of his soul. The truck parked under the blue tarp looked dead. But it only took 3 turns of the key for the engine to cough and start. The black smoke escaping from the exhaust seemed to announce something impossible was about to happen. The car lurched to the edge of the flooded road. Walter turned off the engine, left the door open, and stared into the water. There was no plan. There was no script. Only the certainty that if he didn't go, no one else would. As he slid down the slippery bank, the neighbors watched from their windows. Some even laughed, thinking the old man had completely lost his mind. There goes the crazy guy from House 12 playing hero. They didn't know what he carried in his chest, or on his shoulders. The weight of past failure, the pain of loss, the scar that never healed. Walter felt his feet sink into the cold mud. The wind pushed him sideways. The bones ached as if they were cracking from the inside. But he followed. And with every step, something changed. He was no longer the forgotten man on the balcony. He was the soldier, the father who never was, the friend who was missing, the redeemer of a guilt that could not be explained in words. Now his eyes were no longer blinking. They were fixed on the bus. And with each second, the water rose. The rain came down like a whip, and lightning cut through the sky like punishment. Nature seemed to want to punish the city. But Walter faced everything, as if he were returning to the battlefield. It wasn't the first time he had faced death head-on, but it was the first time he had done so with a tired heart and a broken body. He knelt for a moment at the edge of the stream, took a deep breath, and pulled from his memory an image that kept him standing. The wife. On a sunny day, planting daisies in the garden, saying, "If someone ever needs help, Walter, you'll know." And now he knew. Have you ever felt this? A calling that can't be explained? Write in the comments, "I heard the call." Because there are moments in life when we need to be more than what is expected of us, even if no one sees it. Even if no one believes it. And as the wind picked up and the water threatened to cover the road completely, Walter took the first step into the current. The water was as cold as iron dipped in winter. It rose slowly but steadily, catching Walter just below the waist. The current pushed hard, as if trying to test his resolve, as if trying to turn back time. Once more. Each step was a negotiation with his own pain. The mud pulled his legs under, and the wind cut his face like invisible blades. But he kept going. He had already faced other enemies. He has had jungle fever and shortness of breath in trenches. He has seen good men fall by the wayside without time to scream. But what I saw now was crueler. Helpless children, trapped, scared, with no one who seemed to listen. The lantern hanging from his chest shook with each step, casting crooked beams of light that cut through the flood mist. The silence was broken only by the thunder and the slow crack of the earth slowly giving way around the ravine. Walter didn't look around. His focus was on the bus. Yellowed, shaking, as if it were about to slide off the road. Inside, 12 lives were clinging to wet seats, crying silently or cowering, trying to be invisible in the face of despair. Halfway across, Walter stumbled. A loose stone. A stumble that threw him headlong into the water. For a few seconds, he disappeared. The flashlight was swallowed by the current, and darkness took over the moment. But Walter emerged, panting, coughing, and his eyes brighter than ever. The current had ripped part of the rope off his shoulder, but he was still holding onto it. His fingers were stiff, his knees were shaking. His chest burned with the memory of a broken rib years before, never properly tended to, just forgotten over time. But Walter was not made of common flesh. Inside him was something that age had not been able to erode. The promise he once made to himself to never fail again. Never leave anyone behind again. He reached the back of the bus. He knocked hard on the emergency door, but it wouldn't budge. He tried again. And again. Until he wrapped his fist in an old rag from his pocket and punched the window hard, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The sound of the explosion echoed like a gunshot. And inside the bus, a girl screamed. A boy cowered even more. The driver, unconscious, didn't even react. Walter crawled inside. He was soaked, exhausted, and blood was running down his arm. The children's eyes fixed on him in fear. He said nothing. He just held out his hand. "You first, kid." He pointed to the closest boy. It was a boy with freckles on his face and a torn superhero shirt. He hesitated. His eyes were filled with terror. Walter knelt down with difficulty, and even with his back burning with pain, he spoke firmly. "Everything will be fine. Hold on tight to the rope. Don't let go." The boy looked one last time at his friends, then at Walter's scarred face, and trusted. With each child taken away, Walter seemed to lose a piece of himself. The pain increased. The water kept rising, and the ravine creaked with more force. When he returned for the third time, the lantern had already gone out completely. He was guided only by instinct, by his memory of combat, and by the fragile sound of children's voices. During one of the rescues, a child lost her balance in the middle of the water. Walter dropped his own cane, the one he used every day, to pull her back. She was swept away by the current for 2 meters, and the only reason she didn't disappear was because he threw himself chest first into the water to catch her. Now he limped heavily. His right knee gave out. His back was arched. And his breathing was more sigh than breath. But there were still 3 children left. And he knew to stop now would mean dooming them. Walter came back. One of the girls was clutching a bench so tightly that her fingernails were purple. He spoke to her softly, as if he were speaking to the granddaughter he never had. "Your name is beautiful," he said, even though he didn't know what it was. "And you are strong, much stronger than you think." She slowly let go of the bench. Outside, the wind howled. A tree fell just a few feet from where the rope was tied. The sky seemed to conspire against the rescue, but Walter only looked forward. It wasn't just about saving the children anymore. It was about overcoming something bigger, a past that still weighed on their shoulders, a pain that never had a name. After getting 2 more children to safety, Walter paused for a moment at the edge of the barn where he had sheltered the little ones. He bent over, put his hand to his chest, and nearly fell. His heart seemed to be beating out of rhythm. His arm ached. His vision was dark around the edges. But he got up. Just 1 more. And then he came back. Comment here, just 1 more. Because sometimes that's what separates a hero from surrender. One last decision, one last crossing. And at that moment, Walter was ready for the worst part. The water inside the bus was already up to his ankles. The backpacks were floating, the seats were shaking, and the smell was a mixture of rust, diesel oil, and pure panic. Walter pulled the bloody cloth from his hand, elbowed the shards of glass aside, and got in as best he could. His body bent over, as if he were carrying the weight of all the wars he had fought, and those he was still fighting inside himself. The children were paralyzed. Some hugged their knees, others trembled like leaves in the wind. A boy with thick glasses couldn't stop his teeth from chattering. There was a collective pain in the air, a raw, invisible, but crushing tension. And in that moment, Walter realized that the mission was not just to get bodies off the bus. It was carrying fears, anxieties, and future traumas that didn't even have a name yet. He reached out to the first one. A boy with curly hair, a backpack on his back, and wide eyes of someone who had never looked death so closely. "Everything will be fine. Trust me." The sentence came out hoarse, broken, but it had an old weight, a type of authority that cannot be learned in a rescue course. It can only be achieved through pain. The child obeyed. He climbed down with difficulty, and Walter led him by the rope to the barn. Then he came back. He always came back. By the 3rd inning, the forces began to give way. The water weighed more. The clothes stuck to the body like lead armor, and the pain in my lower back radiated to my neck. Each step was an assault on his own flesh. He almost fell trying to help two children at once. He felt his knee crack. It locked. He stood still for seconds that seemed like minutes. And there, kneeling in the dirty water, Walter felt a fear he had never known. The fear of not being able to finish. The fear of stopping halfway through the mission. The fear of seeing everything fall apart while he was still inside that bus. That was when the memory came back. Strong, as if it were alive. His wife's face, her smell, her firm, sweet voice saying, "You don't have to be young, you just have to be present." And that memory was stronger than the pain. He stood up slowly, shakily. He used the bench for support. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and looked at the 4 children who were still waiting. "We're not stopping now. We're in this together." The current outside was getting stronger. The rope was stretched to its limit. Branches and pieces of wood floated past violently. But Walter didn't give up. He crossed with 2 more. And he came back. This time, the driver had to be dragged. He was unconscious, pale, with his face pressed against the steering wheel. Walter did what he could. He tied the belt to the man's chest, attached it to the rope, and pulled, inch by inch, even as his body collapsed. At one point, he slipped. He fell backwards. His head sank into the water. For a moment, everything went dark. At that moment, Walter thought about leaving. He really thought so, because it was unfair for a man of that age to be left alone in that situation. Because I had already done more than anyone expected. Because the pain was now physical, real, throbbing. Not just a metaphor for overcoming, but an invisible hand pushed him back to the surface. The truth is that he didn't know if it was a survival reflex or a kind of last mission given by something bigger than himself. I only knew that there was still one child left. The smallest. The most scared. The one who couldn't move. A girl with her braids undone and her blouse soaked. She was shaking so hard that Walter had to kneel in front of her, even though his knee was bleeding, to make eye contact. "You are my last mission, and I will not miss the last one," she cried. But she nodded. Walter wrapped her in his arms carefully. He felt his heart beating out of rhythm. His breathing was shallow. His feet were barely responding, and yet he went, step by step, with the girl clinging to his neck. The flashlight turned off, the rope coming undone in some places, and the world collapsing around him. Outside, the barn was already beginning to fill with children's voices, cries of relief, and the occasional nervous laugh. But no one saw Walter at that moment. He was between worlds, between life and the limit, between the past and the promise. When he reached the barn with the last child, he said nothing. He just fell to his knees. He let 2 of the boys hold him by the arm. It was there, with his face pressed against the hay, that he finally let out a long sigh, as if giving up his soul for a moment, and before anyone could say anything, he muttered, "Mission completed." Comment here, mission complete. Because in the end, it's these 3 words that carry more than an accomplishment. They represent a silent transformation. A hidden truth about courage. It doesn't scream. It goes through the storm, and comes back for those who were left behind. The first thing that came back was the sound. The sound of raindrops hitting the barn roof in rhythm. Then the feel of the warm cloth on his face, the smell of wet straw, and a weight on his chest, light but firm. It was the girl. Still asleep on top of him, wrapped in a makeshift blanket. Walter tried to move his hand, but his fingers were numb, as if they had forgotten the path to strength. His shoulder throbbed. His knee felt like cracked glass. His chest burned silently. And inside, everything was tired. But he was alive. And so was she. The children around them whispered to each other. No one shouted, no one ran. It was a respectful silence, as if they knew instinctively that the man on the ground was not just an old man. He was the reason they were all there. Whole. An older girl approached with a bottle of water. Her eyes were red. She offered it to him with trembling hands, as if she was afraid to touch it. Walter made an effort. He sat up slowly, and, even though he was dizzy, he thanked her with a gesture. The water seemed to cut off the path to his stomach, but he needed it. The barn door creaked. Lightning briefly illuminated the interior. That was when a boy pointed out, "Outside! There are people coming!" Headlights cut through the fog. Muffled sirens wailed in the distance. A police car, an ambulance, and right behind it, the fire truck. Help had arrived. But it was too late. Too late to understand that if it were up to them, everyone there would have become a tragic headline. From the group of rescuers, a man ran to the entrance of the barn. When he saw Walter, he stopped abruptly. "It can't be!" Walter looked up slowly, trying to recognize that face wet from the rain. "It's you. It's Granger. Sergeant Granger." The fireman approached cautiously, still in disbelief. "You saved my uncle in the war in '72. He used to tell me about the man who never backed down. I never thought I'd see that man again." Walter closed his eyes for a moment. Uncle's name came to mind like a breath. He remembered. Of course I remembered. It was the boy who had lost his leg and yet tried to walk to reach the helicopter. Walter carried him on his back for 2 days through the dense forest. The firefighter knelt in front of him, placing his hand gently on his injured shoulder. "You're a legend, Mr. Granger, and today, you did it again." Walter didn't answer. He just looked at the child still sleeping in his lap. The unlit flashlight strapped to his chest, the rope lying on the ground like a tired snake, and the echo of something greater than himself, a duty fulfilled. Outside, the rain was beginning to ease. The first rays of sunlight were appearing behind the heavy clouds. The medical teams began to attend to the children, one by one. But none of them wanted to leave Walter's side. They felt something that could not be explained in words, a kind of bond that only forms in the depths of shared fear. A reporter appeared. She arrived with a camera in her hand and an anxious expression of someone who already knew that there was an unusual story there. "Can we do a quick interview, Mr. Granger?" He just looked at her. He took a deep breath. He ran his hand over his face, and he said simply, "It's not about me. It never was." The woman insisted. She spoke of an audience, of recognition, of homage. But Walter stood up with the help of 2 of the firefighters and walked to the barn door. He turned his back to the camera. "I only did what any man should do when he sees an innocent man in danger." And he left, slowly, with heavy steps. The military hat was placed back on his head. His spine was bent, but his presence was still steel. As he walked through the mud, a group of parents arrived, running, crying, calling for their children. The reunion was a spectacle in itself. Screams, hugs, sobs. But among them all, a woman approached Walter. With her eyes full of tears and her hands pressed to her chest, she whispered, "Was it you who saved my daughter? The little one with the pink backpack?" Walter just nodded. The woman fell to her knees as if her body could no longer bear the weight of gratitude. He lifted her up. "She is strong. She saved me too." These words hung in the air as if they carried a hidden meaning, a secret among survivors. And in that moment, there was no more judgment, no more nicknames, no more laughter from neighbors, no more suspicion from those who thought he was just a strange old man. The hidden truth about who Walter Granger was now laid bare for all to see. Write in the comments, "The truth appears when no one expects it," because there are people who only show who they really are when everything is about to fall apart. The sun hadn't yet fully risen, but a faint light was already illuminating the sodden clay around the barn. The fire engine siren now seemed distant, like an echo that no longer mattered. Inside, the silence was sacred. Walter still had his head resting on the straw, the girl asleep on his chest, as if it were the safest place in the world. The children around him didn't speak loudly. Some cried softly. Others just watched, as if they didn't fully understand what had happened, but felt that they were facing something much bigger than they could process. The older firefighter took off his helmet and approached with slow steps, as if entering a temple. Beside him, 2 paramedics stopped, unsure of what to do. The sight was too unexpected. A 90-year-old man, soaked, bloodied, and exhausted, surrounded by saved children, and a broken military flashlight hanging from his chest like a medal he never asked for. Walter tried to stand. His knee gave out. The fireman rushed to help him. But Walter held up his hand. Slowly, slowly. Every word was an effort. Every breath felt like a battle won. His gaze roamed the barn, as if checking a final mission report. And only after seeing everyone alive, only after confirming that no children had been left behind, did he allow the body to rest for a few more seconds. It was then that one of the boys, the one in the green coat, tugged on the fireman's sleeve and pointed to Walter's pocket. "There's something in there." "He's been holding it the whole time." The fireman carefully reached into the pocket of his soaked jacket. He pulled out a small object, wrapped in a cloth that had faded with age. He opened it. It was a photograph. Worn out, cracked in the middle. Almost illegible. In the image, 2 very young soldiers, covered in mud, with torn uniforms and a look of someone who had already seen more than they should. One of them was Walter. The other one was the fireman's uncle. The silence weighed heavily again. And no one there knew that, for years, Walter visited his friend's gravestone twice a year. Once on his birthday, once on the day he lost him in the jungle. In that moment, past and present collided. There was no separating the war hero from the quiet old neighbor. There was no pretending that this was just an act of courage. It was the result of a lifetime of silent battles, of losses swallowed in silence, of decisions that were never forgotten. A journalist who had arrived after the confusion approached with the microphone. But before he could open his mouth, one of the firefighters stopped him. Not now. Because it wasn't time for headlines. It was time for real. The girl in the pink coat woke up. Still sleepy, she looked at Walter, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and said hoarsely, "You're my hero." Walter smiled for the first time. And it wasn't a big smile. It wasn't theatrical. It was a discreet smile, almost shy, like that of someone who finally manages to sleep in peace. Sunlight came through the crack in the roof. It touched his face, and for a second, it felt like all the weight had gone. But no one there knew that this wasn't the first time Walter had saved someone, not the last one, because the impact of a life like his doesn't end with a rescue. He lives on in the memories he leaves behind, in the decisions it inspires, about children who come home because of a stranger who showed up when no one else did. And that morning, what was born there was not just gratitude. It was transformation. It was legacy. Write in the comments. Legacy is not taught. It is lived. Because sometimes a true hero doesn't want applause. He just wants to make sure no one gets left behind. And that, he did. Every step. Every choice. Every scar. Everything had a purpose. And there was still more to come. That morning, the sky was clear for the first time in days. The mud from the flood was beginning to dry on the sidewalks, and the city was returning to its rhythm, as if nothing had happened. But at the end of the dirt road, there was a porch where time seemed to follow a different rhythm. Walter Granger was there, sitting, motionless, with his hat slightly tilted over his eyes and the same expression as always. Calm, attentive, full of memories that no one else carried. The sound of the bike scraping the asphalt came before the shout. "Thank you, Mr. Granger." He did not respond immediately. It took a few seconds, as if he was savoring those words. So, he just raised his hand in a restrained wave. The smile that appeared on his face wasn't one of vanity. It was one of internal recognition. The kind that only those who know they've accomplished something that didn't need to be proven to anyone feel. In the garage, the rope was hanging back, dry, coiled with military precision. The old flashlight was placed next to it, and the clean pocket knife rested on the same faded cloth from the photo. Walter didn't care about showing it to anyone. Not the trophies of what he had lived. Not the scars. Not the nightmares that came back from time to time in the silent early mornings. In the city, newspapers ran sensationalist headlines. War hero saves 12 children in flood. Ignored veteran becomes symbol of courage. Who is the old man who stopped the storm? But those who knew him by sight, and never said good morning, now walked around with a heavy look in their eyes. At the grocery store where he bought tools, the cashier no longer charged him. At the post office, the girl stopped calling him strange gentleman and started asking if he needed anything. At the hospital, he refused to be admitted. He said that resting was something for later, that his body hurt, yes, but that the pain reminded him that he was still alive. Even so, not everything was acceptance. Some commented that it wasn't normal, that a man of that age shouldn't have taken such a risk. That was irresponsible, recklessness, craziness. But these same people, in front of the plaque that the school unveiled in the front garden, remained silent. There was written in deep letters, carved in bronze, "In honor of Walter Granger, who saved 12 hearts at the age of 90, and with the same courage as always." Walter didn't go to the ceremony, not even the official photo. He preferred the sound of the birds, the smell of the wet earth in the flower bed he had been cultivating since his wife left. On the porch, next to the rocking chair, her notebook still rested, where she recorded what she planted, the births of her neighbor's grandchildren, and sometimes even the dreams she had about her husband in times of peace. There, in that small, sacred space, he found his own soul again, in silence. What few people knew is that, on the same afternoon that he refused the national TV interview, Walter wrote a letter. Not for the newspapers, not even for distant children, but for yourself. In firm handwriting he wrote, "I'm still here. I can still hold someone in my arms. I can still hear the cry of someone in need and lift them up. As long as that's true, age doesn't matter. Choice matters." Carefully folded, the letter was placed inside the book he was rereading for the 3rd time, For Whom the Bell Tolls. And there it stayed. A few days later, one of the children, now more talkative, passed by the house with his grandmother. He saw Walter sitting there and ran over to him. In his pocket, he had a plastic keychain in the shape of a star. "For you. I made it myself." Walter took the object with trembling hands. He looked at it as if it were a medal received on the battlefield. "Thank you, soldier," he said. The boy widened his eyes. "But I'm not a soldier." Walter smiled. Not yet. In that simple gesture, loaded with hidden truth, a new journey began. Not for him, but for those who saw him. The impact was launched, sown. And even if he never again crossed a raging river or broke glass with his fist, his legacy would walk the city streets with small feet, noisy bicycles, and hearts full of courage. Comment here. Courage has no age. Because there are people who go through life in silence, but leave traces that no one forgets. If you've stayed with me this far, it's because something in this story touched you deeply. Maybe it was Walter's silence, or the strength he found even when everything seemed to be falling apart. Either way, these stories remind us that there are people who go through life leaving more than just footprints. They leave a purpose. If this made sense to you, leave a comment. I believe in silent legacies. Just so I know you were here, felt all of this, and walked to the end with me. Take advantage and leave a like too. Not only because it helps the channel, but because it's like shaking the hand of someone who lived through it all and saying, "I saw it, I recognize it." And if you want to continue diving into stories that transform, that inspire, that awaken something true, subscribe to the channel. There are a lot of things like this coming, and I want you close by. By the way, there's a video here that complements this journey. Click and follow me there, because some stories don't end. They just start in a different way.